Ashley Floor, and you know what I'm talking about here on my channel right now.
Ryan Reynolds has spent years building one of the most recognizable public personas in Hollywood: quick-witted, self-aware, effortlessly charming, the kind of guy who can turn sarcasm into a brand and humor into armor. To millions, he's the nice guy, the playful husband, the devoted father, the actor who doesn't take himself too seriously. But every once in a while, a different narrative starts creeping into the conversation, one that doesn't match the polished image. And when you line up certain stories, interviews, and resurfaced moments, some people begin asking a question that's hard to ignore: is the persona real, or is it carefully constructed? Now, before going any further, it's important to be clear: none of this is a clinical diagnosis, and no one here is pretending to be a professional. What we're looking at is a collection of claims, old interviews, anecdotes, and public behavior that critics interpret in a certain way. The word sociopath gets thrown around a lot online, often loosely, sometimes irresponsibly. But the reason it keeps coming up in discussions around Ryan Reynolds isn't random. It's tied to patterns people believe they're seeing. One of the most talked about elements in this narrative is something often referenced in pop psychology discussions: early behavioral signs that, in extreme cases, are associated with troubling personality traits. Again, not proof of anything on its own, but people tend to revisit childhood stories when trying to understand adult behavior. And in Ryan's case, one particular story keeps resurfacing. In an old interview from the early 2000s, Ryan Reynolds openly described himself as a difficult kid, an instigator, someone who pushed limits, someone who didn't exactly follow the rules. That alone isn't unusual. A lot of people had chaotic childhoods. But what stood out to critics was a specific admission: he talked about setting fire to a tree when he was younger, which allegedly led to significant damage at his elementary school. At the time, he framed it almost casually, even humorously, suggesting the statute of limitations had likely passed, and joking about hoping no one else got blamed. That tone is what stuck with people. Not just the act itself, but the way it was remembered. Because when people hear stories involving fire, especially tied to childhood behavior, they don't just hear a kid made a mistake. They start connecting dots, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. What makes this more complicated is that older newspaper archives from Vancouver in the late 1980s did report a major school fire, a serious one. Images from that time show a building heavily damaged, flames consuming large portions of the structure. Now, whether the scale described in those reports aligns perfectly with Ryan's later retelling is something people debate. Some say he downplayed it. Others say it's been exaggerated online. But either way, the story refuses to disappear, and here's where perception starts to shift. Because it's one thing for something like that to happen in childhood, it's another thing entirely to bring it up years later, in a professional interview, almost as a quirky anecdote. That disconnect is what fuels suspicion for some observers. They don't just focus on the act, they focus on the attitude toward it. From there, the conversation moves into personality. Critics argue that throughout his career, Ryan has shown signs of being highly calculated in how he presents himself. Not just funny, but strategically funny. Not just charming, but consistently, almost mechanically charming. The kind of consistency that, to some, doesn't feel natural. It feels rehearsed. There are also stories, unverified, but widely circulated, about his early behavior in acting classes. One particular anecdote describes a young Ryan being disruptive, attention-seeking, difficult to manage. According to that story, he was removed from a class, only to return and deliver an emotional apology, which he later admitted was entirely performed. If true, some see that as an early example of emotional manipulation, the ability to display feeling without actually experiencing it. Again, none of this proves anything on its own. Plenty of actors are dramatic as kids. Plenty of people experiment with attention and identity when they're young. But when these stories are placed next to each other, they start forming a narrative, not necessarily a confirmed truth, but a pattern that people interpret in their own way. And then there's the humor. Ryan Reynolds' entire brand is built on humor, sarcasm, irony, self-deprecation. But humor can be complicated. What one person sees as playful, another sees as cutting. What one audience laughs at, another finds uncomfortable. And over the years, there have been moments where his jokes didn't land the way they were intended, especially when they involved people close to him. One example that often gets brought up is his tendency to post unflattering photos of Blake Lively on social media, usually framed as a joke. At the time, fans loved it. It felt like a couple teasing each other. But looking back, some critics question whether there was more behind it. Because humor, especially repeated humor, can sometimes reveal underlying dynamics. Was it harmless? Probably, in many cases. But when combined with other narratives, allegations of control, influence, or manipulation, even small things start getting reinterpreted. That's how public perception shifts. Not through one major event, but through dozens of small moments being viewed through a different lens. Another moment that sparked discussion was a joke Ryan made during an interview about parenthood, specifically saying that if his family were ever in danger, he would use his wife as a human shield to protect their child. Delivered in a comedic tone, it got laughs. But outside that context, it raised eyebrows. Because when you strip away the humor, the statement itself sounds harsh. That's the duality people keep circling back to, intent versus impact. Is he joking? Almost always, but does every joke land the way he thinks it does? Not necessarily, and when critics look at the bigger picture, they start asking whether humor is being used as a shield, a way to say things that would otherwise be unacceptable, but pass because they're wrapped in comedy. There have also been subtle tensions reported in professional settings. Comments from co-stars, moments in interviews, small remarks that suggest he can be dismissive or controlling behind the scenes. Nothing definitive. Nothing that alone would mean much. But again, patterns, even public figures outside his immediate circle have made remarks that caught attention. Martha Stewart, for example, once described him as not particularly funny in real life, a surprising statement, given his reputation. While it may have been offhand or exaggerated, it added another layer to the conversation, the idea that the public version of Ryan Reynolds might not fully match the private one. And that's really what this entire discussion revolves around, not one incident, not one claim, but the gap between image and perception, because in Hollywood, image is everything. It's curated, polished, protected. And the more perfect it looks, the more people start looking for cracks. Now, where this starts to intersect with Blake Lively is where things become even more complicated. Because when two public figures are closely tied, personally and professionally, their narratives start blending. And if one of them faces controversy, the other often gets pulled into it. Some critics believe Ryan has had a strong influence over Blake's public decisions, especially in recent legal and professional situations. That he encourages certain moves, supports certain narratives, and then distances himself when things get messy. That's the allegation, at least. As the conversation moves beyond old interviews and childhood stories, it starts focusing on something far more immediate, the present-day dynamic between Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively. Because whatever people think about his past, what's happening now is what's really fueling the speculation. And in recent years, especially with legal tension, media narratives, and resurfaced clips, the spotlight hasn't just been on Ryan as an individual, it's been on the relationship as a whole. From the outside, their marriage has always been presented as playful, almost perfect. Two successful actors, constantly joking with each other online, supporting each other publicly, showing just enough of their personal life to stay relatable without revealing too much. It worked. For a long time, people saw them as one of Hollywood's most likable couples. But the problem with a perfectly managed image is that when something feels off, even slightly, people notice faster. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. Small moments that didn't quite align with the established narrative. Comments that felt slightly out of place. Appearances where one person seemed more present than the other. And then, eventually, a larger situation emerged, one that pulled both of them into a more serious, less controlled environment. Legal conflict. As Blake Lively became more publicly involved in a dispute tied to her professional work, attention intensified. Legal battles have a way of stripping away the polished surface celebrities rely on. They force documentation, timelines, private communications, things that aren't filtered through PR teams in the same way interviews and social media posts are. And once that process begins, narratives start to compete with each other. One of the biggest talking points that came out of this period wasn't just the case itself, but Ryan's role in it, or, depending on who you ask, his lack of visible presence at key moments. Observers noticed that during certain public developments, particularly court-related appearances, Blake appeared alone. Now, there could be dozens of explanations for that: scheduling conflicts, legal strategy, personal decisions that aren't public. But online, absence tends to get interpreted in the most dramatic way possible. For critics already skeptical of Ryan's influence, this became confirmation of a theory they had been building, that he plays a strong role in shaping decisions behind the scenes, but steps back when those decisions lead to controversy. Again, this is interpretation, not verified fact, but it spread quickly because it fits a narrative people were already starting to believe. At the same time, previously overlooked moments began resurfacing and being viewed through a different lens. Interviews where Ryan spoke on Blake's behalf. Public speeches where he positioned himself within conversations that didn't directly involve him. Even award show appearances where his commentary seemed to stretch beyond the original purpose. None of these moments were necessarily problematic on their own, but in the context of growing skepticism, they started to feel calculated. There was one particular appearance that drew attention, a speech where Ryan discussed how stories about women are held to different standards. On the surface, it sounded supportive, even thoughtful. But critics questioned the timing. Why step into that conversation at that moment? Why position himself as a voice in it? For some, it came across as strategic, aligning himself with a narrative that also supported his wife's position during a sensitive time. This is where the idea of image management becomes central. Because in Hollywood, nothing exists in isolation. Public statements, interviews, appearances, they all contribute to a broader perception. And when someone is known for being media savvy, as Ryan Reynolds undeniably is, people start assuming intention behind everything. That assumption extends into his communication style as well. Leaked or shared messages tied to production discussions painted a picture, not necessarily of wrongdoing, but of a tone that some found off-putting. Overly familiar, slightly performative, sometimes blurring the line between humor and pressure. It's the kind of communication that might work in a casual setting but feels different when attached to professional decisions. And then there's the issue of how he interacts with people in different positions, peers, collaborators, even children in public settings. One widely discussed moment involved a young interview. The interaction was brief, but it left an impression. Ryan, staying in his usual sarcastic tone, moved quickly past the introduction and pushed toward the question. To adults familiar with his humor, it might have seemed normal. But to many viewers, especially considering the age of the interview, it came across as dismissive. That moment went viral not because it was extreme, but because it highlighted something subtle. Humor doesn't translate the same way in every context. And when your entire public identity relies on a specific kind of humor, those mismatches become more noticeable. A similar pattern appears in how he talks about family. Ryan often uses humor when discussing his children, exaggeration, irony, sometimes shock value. For many fans, it's entertaining. But for others, certain jokes cross a line. Comments that feel overly graphic, or that assign strange characteristics to very young children, tend to create discomfort rather than laughter. One particular controversy centered around a line delivered by his daughter in a film project. The inclusion of a child in that kind of dialogue raised questions, not necessarily about legality, but about judgment. Reports suggested she was hesitant at first, that multiple takes were involved, that the process wasn't entirely straightforward. Again, the exact details are debated, but the perception that formed was clear. People felt uneasy, and that unease feeds into a larger narrative about boundaries. Where does humor stop? Where does influence become pressure? Where does performance cross into something more personal? Even within the industry, there have been hints, small, scattered, but persistent, that not everyone shares the public's perception of Ryan. Comments from co-stars, stories from past collaborations, offhand remarks in interviews. None of them explosive on their own, but together they suggest that working with him isn't always as effortless as his public image might imply. T.J. Miller's comments, for example, stood out because they described a moment that felt less like friendly banter and more like a subtle assertion of hierarchy. Speaking to someone not as a colleague, but as someone beneath the main focus. Whether that interpretation is fair or not depends on perspective, but the fact that it was said at all adds to the conversation. And then there's the recurring theme of control, not in a dramatic, obvious sense, but in a quieter, more strategic way. Control over narrative, over tone, over how situations are framed. It's something many successful actors develop over time, especially those who transition into producing or managing their own projects. But when that control extends into personal relationships, or appears to, it becomes more controversial. This brings everything back to Blake Lively. Because if the perception exists that Ryan is highly influential behind the scenes, then any major decision she makes gets viewed through that lens. Is it her choice? Is it a shared strategy? Is it something encouraged, or even pushed? There's no clear answer to that. Only speculation, but speculation thrives in environments where information is incomplete. And right now, that's exactly the situation. Legal processes are ongoing. Public statements are limited. And the gap between what's known and what's assumed continues to grow. Meanwhile, the internet does what it always does, it revisits everything. Old clips, old jokes, old interviews. Things that once felt harmless now get reinterpreted. Patterns get drawn. Narratives get reinforced, and once a certain narrative takes hold, it becomes very difficult to shake. That's the position Ryan Reynolds seems to be in right now. Not definitively exposed, not proven to be anything extreme, but no longer existing in a space where his image goes unquestioned. The nice guy persona that once felt effortless is now being examined piece by piece, with people asking whether it was ever as simple as it seemed, because in the end, this isn't really about one label or one accusation. It's about contrast, the contrast between public and private, between humor and impact, between image and interpretation, and once people start focusing on that contrast, they don't just look at what's being shown, they start looking for what isn't. Whether any of these concerns are justified, exaggerated, or completely misunderstood is something that will likely remain debated. But one thing is certain, the conversation has shifted, and once that shift happens in Hollywood, it rarely goes back to the way it was before.